The hum of the atmospheric stabilizers was the only thing keeping me from losing my mind. It was 300 hours in the morning, the deadest part of the shift at Bastion 9, and the recycled air tasted like burnt copper and old regrets. I had been walking the same 500 meters of cold titanium flooring for 6 months. 6 months of staring into the pitch-black abyss of the night side, waiting for a Vash raiding party that everyone promised was coming, but never arrived. The pay was decent, but the isolation was a slow-acting poison. My only company was the occasional skittering of a maintenance drone and the ghost of my sister, Lyra, who seemed to live in the peripheral of my vision every time the lights flickered. I was thinking about caffeine, specifically the high-octane sludge they served in the mess hall, when my internal comms link buzzed. It was a faint, rhythmic scratching. Not the metallic click of a drone, but something organic, something careful. I checked my HUD. The motion sensors were silent. The thermal sweep showed nothing but the steady, dull blue of the cooling pipes. But I had been a Sentinel long enough to know that tech lied when it got tired, and Bastion 9 was exhausted. I gripped the hilt of my pulse blade. I did not draw it yet. Drawing a blade meant I was looking for a fight, and at this hour I was mostly looking for an excuse to go back to my bunk. I moved toward Supply Vault Gamma. This was where we kept the photic crystals, the glowing heartstones that powered our entire colony. If the Vash were going to hit us anywhere, it would be here. The heavy blast door was supposed to be sealed with a triple-layer encryption. Instead, it was hissed open just a few centimeters. A sliver of violet light leaked out from the interior, casting long, jagged shadows against the hallway. I cut my internal comms. I did not want some frantic dispatcher screaming in my ear and giving away my position. Protocol dictated I call for backup, wait for a 5-man fire team, and engage with non-lethal suppressors. But my gut told me that by the time a fire team got their boots on, whatever was inside would be gone. I slipped through the gap, my boots making no sound on the magnetized floor. Inside the vault was a forest of translucent crates, and there, standing in the center of a pile of photic crystals, was a shadow stalker. She was at least 2 meters tall, her skin a deep, matte obsidian that seemed to swallow the light. But her veins, they were glowing. A soft, sickly amber light pulsed under her crystalline skin, tracing the lines of her powerful muscles. She was Vash, the species we were taught to call frostbiters or glints. They were supposed to be mindless monsters of the cold, but the way she was moving was anything but mindless. She was not looking for a weapon. She was not planting a thermite charge. She was holding a single high-grade photic crystal to her chest, her fingers trembling against the glass. "Freeze," I said, my voice sounding like grinding gravel in the silence. I leveled my pulse blade. The blue energy hummed to life, illuminating the vault in a harsh electric glare. "Drop the crystal and put your hands where the HUD can track them. One wrong move, and I will turn you into a pile of glass shards." The Vash woman froze. She did not reach for the jagged obsidian dagger at her waist. She did not lunge at me with the superhuman speed the training videos warned us about. Instead, she slowly turned around. Her eyes were not the predatory yellow I expected. They were wide, clouded with a milky white film and leaking a shimmering, bioluminescent fluid. She was crying. "Please," she whispered. Her voice was a shock. It sounded like two stones rubbing together, a deep, resonant vibration that I felt in my chest. Vash were not supposed to speak common. They were supposed to hiss and roar. "I just need the light," she said, her grip tightening on the crystal. "Just one." "Shut it," I snapped, though my hand was shaking. "Hands up, now. This is a restricted zone, and you are KIA if you do not comply. You are a long way from the night side, Glint. How did you even get past the perimeter shields?" "The shadows," she murmured, her amber veins flickering erratically. "The shields have a blind spot at the thermal vents." I waited for 10 hours in the frost. I waited for the rotation. She lowered her hands, but she did not drop the crystal. She tucked it into a small, weathered leather pouch at her side. "I do not want your blood, Sentinel. I do not want your war. My son, Malik, he is dimming." I felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the atmospheric stabilizers. The dimming was a legend among the Sentinels. We were told it was a biological failure, a sign that the Vash were an evolutionary dead end. They said it turned them into mindless husks. The healers say his heart light is fading, she continued, her voice breaking. They say without a pure crystal from the dayside, he will shatter before the next lunar cycle. He is only 5 years old. 5 years old. I looked at her, really looked at her. Her armor was held together by wire and prayer. Her skin was scarred with frost burns. She did not look like a warrior. She looked like a ghost that had been running for a lifetime. Protocol, Kalen, I told myself. Sound the alarm. Earn your promotion. Be the hero the Coalition wants. But then I thought of Lyra. I thought of the way she had reached for me when the solar flare had breached our shelter. She had been 6. She had asked for a glass of water, and I had been too scared to move, too paralyzed by the sirens to do anything but watch her fade away. What is your name? I asked. The question felt like treason. It was a breach of the soldier's code. You do not ask the enemy for their name. You give them a serial number or a grave. Zylara, she said, her bioluminescence stabilizing into a soft, desperate gold. Of the silken crest. Well, Zylara, I said, slowly lowering the tip of my blade, you have just committed an act of interstellar terrorism. If I pull this trigger, the automated turrets will turn this vault into a vacuum. Then do it, she said, stepping toward me. Her eyes were fierce now, the tears drying into glowing streaks on her cheeks. If I return without the light, he dies. If I die here, he dies. The outcome is the same. But if you have even a spark of the sun in your soul, you will let me go. I looked at the crystal in her bag. It was worth 50,000 credits on the black market. It could power a human city block for a year. I looked at the door. In 20 minutes, the next patrol would sweep this sector. Corporal Vance was a stickler for detail. He would notice the scratched floor. He would smell the ozone. Pick up your bag, I said, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. She stared at me, her crystalline brow furrowing. What? I am not going to repeat myself, I growled, glancing at the security camera in the corner. I had already looped the footage for 30 seconds, a trick I learned for sneaking extra rations. But I could not keep it up forever. Pick up the bag and move to the service conduit in the back. Now. Why? She asked, her voice hushed. Because I am an idiot, Zylara. And because I know what it is like to watch a child go dark, because the rules said there was not enough light to go around. She did not thank me. She did not have time. She moved with a fluid, terrifying grace toward the conduit, but stopped just before disappearing into the dark. Sentinel, she said. My name is Kalen, I said. Now get out of here before I change my mind and put a bolt through your head. Strength protects, Kalen Vane, she whispered, using a Vash blessing I had only heard in interrogation tapes, but mercy endures. Then she was gone, a shadow returning to the shadows. I stood in the silence of the vault, the violet light of the crystals reflecting in my visor, and I knew that my life as I knew it had ended the moment I lowered my blade. I spent the next 2 hours scrub cleaning the vault floor with a chemical solvent I swiped from the janitorial closet. My hands were steady, but my mind was a foobar mess of conflicting directives. I had just aided and abetted a vast shadow stalker. In the eyes of the Solari Coalition, I was no longer a sentinel. I was a flatliner, a traitor waiting for a court-martial. I managed to reset the encryption on the door just as the first hint of the artificial dawn began to bleed through the station's atmospheric filters. Kalen! A voice barked over the local comms. I jumped, nearly dropping the solvent canister. It was Miller, a gearhead from the engineering deck who usually spent his shifts complaining about the humidity. Yeah, Miller, I said, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. The captain wants a full inventory of Gamma Vault. Some sensor glitch reported a pressure drop an hour ago. You see anything? I looked at the empty spot on the shelf where the high-grade crystal had been. My stomach did a slow roll. Negative, I said. Just a faulty seal on the ventilation duct. I patched it up. It is all clear here. Good. Get your ass to the mess hall. It is Friday, which means we are getting that synth steak that tastes like recycled boot leather. I signed off and leaned my head against the cold titanium wall. I was safe for now, but the guilt was a heavy weight in my chest. I was a soldier of the Coalition. I had taken an oath to protect the light of humanity against the encroaching dark. And yet I had just given our most precious resource to a woman whose people had killed my friends, my mentors, my comrades. But I could still see her eyes, that milky, desperate white. I left the vault and made my way through the labyrinthine corridors of Bastion 9. The station was waking up. Hundreds of soldiers were filing out of their barracks, their armor clanking, their voices a dull roar of military slang and cynical jokes. "Hey, Vane!" One of the younger recruits, a kid named Jax, waved at me. "You look like you went 10 rounds with a hull crusher. Bad shift?" "Just the usual, Jax," I muttered, walking past him. "Keep your eyes on the night side." I did not go to the mess hall. Instead, I went to my private quarters, a tiny metal box that smelled of ozone and loneliness. I sat on my bunk and pulled out a small, cracked data pad. I had a hidden file on it, something I had compiled over years of serving on the border. It was a collection of Vash physiology reports, mostly stolen from the medical archives. I searched for the dimming. The data was clinical and cold. It described a degenerative condition where the Vash's internal biocrystalline structure began to lose its ability to store energy. It was common in children born in the deep frost zones where the natural light of the sun never reached. The treatment was radiant immersion, but the coalition had banned the export of photic crystals to the night side 50 years ago. We were not just fighting a war, we were enforcing a slow, silent extinction. A knock at my door made me freeze. I hid the data pad under my pillow and gripped the stun baton near my bed. "Who is it?" "It is me, Kalen." "Open up." I relaxed slightly. It was Commander Draxos. He was the closest thing I had to a friend in this godforsaken outpost. He was an older man, his face a map of scars and medals, who had seen enough combat to know that the regulations were often written by people who had never seen a drop of blood. I opened the door. Draxos stood there, his arms crossed over his chest, his eyes narrowed. "You missed the morning briefing," he said. "That is not like you." "I had a long night, Commander, just catching up on some rack time." Draxos stepped into the room, his presence making the small space feel even smaller. He looked around, his gaze lingering on the empty holster on my desk. "I heard about the pressure drop in Vault Gamma," he said quietly. "I also heard that the security logs for that sector have a 30-second loop. A very professional loop, the kind only a veteran Sentinel would know how to script." My heart stopped. I looked at Draxos, searching for any sign of a trap. "I do not know what you are talking about, sir." Draxos sighed and sat down on my single chair. He looked tired, not just sleepy, but bone-weary. "Kalen, I have known you since you were a cadet. I saw you pull 3 men out of a burning dropship during the siege of Ethel Prime. I know your heart, and I know you have been looking at the night side with more than just a soldier's eyes for a long time." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "The Vash woman, Zylara. How did she look?" I didn't even try to lie. There was no point. Draxos had already put the pieces together. "She looked like she was dying," I said. "She looked like she was carrying the weight of the whole world in a small leather bag." "And you let her go?" "Yes." Draxos closed his eyes and rubbed his temples. "Do you have any idea what they will do to you if the High Command finds out? They will not just strip your rank, they will use you as a test subject for the new neural reconditioning units. You will forget your own name, Kalen." "I know." "Then why? Why risk everything for a glint?" "Because she had a son, Commander. A 5-year-old boy who is dimming, and because I am tired of being the one who turns off the lights." Draxos was silent for a long time. Outside, the sound of a transport ship taking off rumbled through the floorboards. 30 years ago, Draxos said, his voice barely a whisper, "I was stationed at a remote listening post in the Twilight Ring. I got caught in a localized blizzard. My heating unit failed. I was 3 kilometers from the base, and I was ready to accept the freeze. I waited for the rest of the story. A Vash scout found me," Draxos continued. "He could have taken my head as a trophy. Instead, he dragged me into a cave, shared his internal warmth with me for 6 hours, and left a glowing stone by my side so the rescue teams could find me. He never said a word. He just saved me because I was a living thing that was cold." He looked at me, his eyes wet with a sudden, sharp grief. "I have spent 3 decades trying to justify why I am still fighting them, Kalen. I have spent 3 decades telling myself that he was the exception. But then I see men like you, and I realize that we are all just terrified children holding on to our flashlights in the dark. He stood up and walked to the door. I am going to delete those sensor logs myself, he said. I will tell the brass that the pressure drop was a calibration error. But Kalen, you cannot stay here. What do you mean? The coalition is planning a major push into the night side. They are going to seize the Vash hatcheries. They want the crystals and they want the territory. If you are here when that happens, you will be forced to pull the trigger on people like Xylera. Where would I go? Go to the Twilight Ring, Draxos said. There are rumors of a neutral settlement there, a place where the outcasts and the deserters are building something new. Find her. Help her save her son. Because if there is even a chance that we can stop this war before it burns us all to ash, it starts with people like you. He handed me a small encrypted key card. This will get you past the outer perimeter gate. You have 1 hour before the shift change. Oscar Mike, Kalen, get out of here. I looked at the key card, then at the man who had been like a father to me. Thank you, Leonard. Do not thank me, he said, his voice hardening into the commander's tone again. If I ever see you on the battlefield, I will have to kill you. Now move. I grabbed my gear, a light tactical vest, my pulse blade, and a few days' worth of nutrient packs. I did not take any pictures. I did not leave a note. I walked out of Bastion 9 as the sun began to climb higher in the sky, casting a long, golden shadow toward the eternal night. The Twilight Ring was 20 kilometers away. It was a land of jagged cliffs, violet flora, and air so thin it felt like breathing through a straw. It was the most dangerous place on Ethelgard. But as I stepped through the perimeter gate and felt the first kiss of the freezing wind on my face, I did not feel afraid. For the first time in 6 months, I felt like a human being again. I was no longer just a soldier. I was a bridge. I adjusted my oxygen mask and checked the tracker I had secretly planted on Xylara's leather bag. The signal was faint, a tiny pulsing amber dot deep in the glacial maw. I began to run. Behind me, the towers of the Solari Coalition looked like teeth in the sunlight. In front of me, the dark was waiting. And somewhere in that dark, a 5-year-old boy was waiting for a miracle that came in a stolen bag. I had 24 hours to cross the ring before my disappearance would be flagged as a desertion. 24 hours to find an enemy I was supposed to hate and a future I was never supposed to have. The wind howled, sounding like 1,000 Vash voices, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. Strength protects, Xylera had said, but love endures. I was going to find out if she was right. The transition from the scorched plains of the dayside to the Twilight Ring was not a line, but a descent into madness. One moment, the sun was a punishing hammer of white gold that threatened to melt the titanium joints of my tactical boots. The next, the light began to bruise, turning a deep, sickly violet as the atmospheric dust of the border strip swallowed the rays. I was 10 kilometers deep into the neutral zone, and the temperature had already dropped 30 degrees. My internal thermal regulator hissed, struggling to compensate for the sudden chill that ate through my specialized Sentinel weave. I checked my HUD. The amber dot representing Xylara was still 6 kilometers ahead, buried deep within the crystalline canyons of the glacial maw. My oxygen levels were sitting at 85%, which would have been plenty for a standard patrol, but I was pushing a pace that no gear grinder back at Bastion 9 would ever recommend. I was bugging out, a lone deserter running toward a frozen hell with nothing but a pulse blade and a conscience that felt like a lead weight in my chest. A sound tore through the whistling wind, a high-pitched mechanical whine that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was the sound of a seeker drone, specifically a Talon 7 interceptor. The Solari Coalition had realized I was missing sooner than I had hoped. Leonard must have been unable to delay the automated roll call, or perhaps the central AI had flagged my unauthorized exit through the perimeter gate. Either way, I was no longer just a soldier on a stroll. I was a target. I dove behind a cluster of shimmer moss, the bioluminescent flora of the ring. The moss was soft and cold, pulsing with a faint indigo light that mirrored the rhythm of my own frantic heart. I pressed my face into the dirt, smelling the sharp metallic scent of frozen minerals and ancient decay. Above me, the Talon 7 swept the area, its crimson scanning laser painting the violet rocks in streaks of blood-red light. If that laser touched me, I was a dead man. The drone was programmed to neutralize any biological signature that did not broadcast an active IFF signal. Since I had shredded my internal beacon 5 kilometers back, I was nothing more than a rogue element to be terminated. I waited, barely breathing, as the drone hovered directly above my hiding spot. I could hear the micro-adjustments of its thrusters, a sound like a swarm of angry hornets. In that silence, the memories I had been trying to outrun for 15 years finally caught up to me. I saw Lyra again. She was standing in the doorway of our colonial hab unit on the day the Great Flare hit. She was 6 years old, clutching a tattered stuffed rabbit that had lost one eye. The sirens had been screaming, a sound that tore through the soul, warning us that the planetary shields had failed. Our parents were gone, lost in the first wave of the heat blast at the mining facility. I was 12, and I was supposed to be the man of the house. The rules were clear. In the event of a shield breach, you head for the reinforced bunkers, and you do not stop for anyone. You do not help the elderly. You do not wait for friends. Every second wasted was a life lost. I had grabbed Lyra's hand and ran, but she had tripped. Her knee was bleeding, a bright red against the white dust of the colony. She was crying, calling for Mom, calling for me to wait. I had looked back and seen the wall of white fire rolling across the horizon. It was a sunstorm, a literal piece of the star coming to claim us. And I had hesitated. For 5 seconds I had stood there, torn between the rule that said keep moving and the love that said stay. Those 5 seconds cost her everything. A piece of debris kicked up by the pressure wave had struck her down. I had reached for her, but the heat was already melting the air. I had survived because a neighbor dragged me into the bunker just as the door sealed. I had followed the rules of survival, and the cost was my sister's life. The memory burned hotter than the sun. I realized then, lying in the freezing moss of the Twilight Ring, that I had been following rules ever since to dull the pain. I became a sentinel because it was a life of orders. Do this. Shoot that. Guard this door. It was easy to be a good soldier because it meant I didn't have to be a good person. But Sylara had broken that armor. She hadn't asked me to follow a rule. She had asked me to see her. The drone's whine began to fade. The crimson light vanished from the rocks. I waited another 2 minutes before I dared to lift my head. The sky was a deep, bruised purple, and the stars were beginning to peek through the atmospheric haze. They looked cold, like distant diamonds scattered on black velvet. I checked the tracker. Sylara had stopped moving. She was in a stationary position 4 kilometers ahead, likely waiting for the cover of total darkness to make the final push into the night side. I stood up, my joints popping, and adjusted my pack. Time to move, I whispered to the empty air. The terrain became more treacherous as I entered the glacial maw. This was where the planet's crust had buckled under the gravitational pull of its twin moons, creating a labyrinth of ice-choked canyons and razor-sharp obsidian spires. The Vash called this place the throat of the Great Shadow. For a human, it was a death trap. The air was so thin here that my lungs burned with every step, and the ground was a patchwork of black ice and unstable shale. I saw movement to my left, a flicker of something pale and spindly, an ice lizard, a native predator that lived on the warmth of other creatures. It was the size of a large dog, with 6 legs tipped in serrated claws and skin that mimicked the texture of frozen stone. It watched me with pale, lidless eyes, sensing the heat leaking from my tactical suit. "Not today, Roach," I muttered, tapping the activation switch on my pulse blade. The blue energy flickered to life, casting long, dancing shadows against the canyon walls. The lizard hissed, a sound like steam escaping a pipe, and vanished back into the crevices. As I climbed a steep ridge, the view opened up, and I saw something that took what little breath I had left. Below me, nestled in a valley of glowing violet flora, was a small Vash outpost. It wasn't the fortress I had expected. There were no turrets, no reinforced walls. It was a collection of organic, translucent structures that looked like they had been grown from the ground rather than built. They pulsed with a soft, rhythmic light, blue, green, and a pale, ghostly white. It was beautiful. In 80 years of war, no human soldier had ever been allowed to see a Vash settlement and live. Our intelligence reports always described their camps as dens of filth and primitive war warns. But this place looked like a cathedral made of glass and starlight. I saw Vash civilians moving between the structures, their bioluminescent veins glowing with a calm, peaceful gold. I saw children playing with spheres of captured light, their laughter a melodic chiming that echoed off the canyon walls. My training told me to mark the coordinates for an orbital strike. My HUD was already highlighting the structural weaknesses of the central spire. One concentrated beam from the Ethelgard satellite would turn this entire valley into a crater of molten glass. I looked at the targeting reticle dancing in my vision. I looked at the little Vash girl chasing a shimmer butterfly near a pond of liquid nitrogen. The rules said they were monsters. The rules said their existence was a threat to the Solari Coalition. The rules said that peace was only possible through total dominance. I reached up and manually overrode my HUD. I deleted the targeting data and wiped the local cache. I wasn't a soldier anymore. I was a man who had seen too much light to believe in the dark anymore. I began the descent into the valley, my boots crunching on the frozen grass. I didn't hide. I didn't draw my blade. I walked openly, my hands held away from my weapons, a ghost in a green tactical suit walking into a world of violet light. Halfway down the slope, a shadow detached itself from the rocks. Kaelin? Zalara stepped into the light of a nearby glow tree. She looked exhausted, her obsidian skin dusty, and her amber veins flickering with a low, dim light. She held a long, crystalline spear tipped in jagged flint, but the point was lowered toward the ground. "You followed me," she said, her voice a mix of disbelief and hope. "I told you I'd help," I said, stopping 10 meters away. "And I'm a man of my word, even if that word makes me a traitor." She studied me for a long moment, her white eyes searching mine. Behind her, 3 more Vash warriors emerged from the shadows. They were taller than Zalara, their skin a darker shade of black, and their veins pulsed with a sharp, aggressive red. They raised their weapons, the air around them humming with kinetic energy. One of the warriors shouted something in the Vash tongue, a harsh, clicking language that sounded like ice cracking under pressure. "He is a sun demon, Zalara. Why have you brought death to our door?" "He is the reason I have the light," Zalara shouted back, her voice commanding and fierce. "He let me go. He chose mercy over the code." The warriors didn't lower their spears. They looked at me with a hatred that had been cultivated over generations. To them, I wasn't a man. I was the face of the bombs that fell on their cities, the face of the soldiers who had pushed them into the frost. "If you want to kill me, do it now," I said, speaking clearly so they could understand. "But I have the medical specs for the radiant immersion on my datapad. I have a portable power cell that can boost the crystal's output by 300%. Your son doesn't have much time, does he?" The lead warrior, a scarred veteran with a missing tusk, took a step forward. He looked at the pulse blade at my hip, then at the human insignia on my shoulder. "Why?" he hissed. "Why would a killer of Vash care if a child shatters?" "Because I'm tired of seeing children shatter," I said. "And because the rules that say we are enemies are the same rules that are killing your son." Zalara walked over to the lead warrior and placed a hand on his arm. She whispered something to him, a low, urgent melody. The warrior looked at her, then at me, and finally he spat on the ground. He lowered his spear but did not sheath it. "If he moves toward the nursery, I will take his heart," the warrior said in broken common. Zalara turned back to me, her face soft. "Come, Kaelin Vane. Malik is waiting." The light is fading fast. The interior of the Vash settlement was even more alien than the outside. The walls were made of a living, silica-based resin that felt warm to the touch, almost like skin. It hummed with a low-frequency vibration that seemed to harmonize with the bioluminescent veins of the inhabitants. As I walked through the corridors, the Vash civilians pressed themselves against the walls, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and curiosity. I was the first human many of them had ever seen without a rifle in my hands. Zalara led me toward the center of the settlement, to a large dome structure called the Heart Hearth. This was where the Vash brought their sick, their elderly, and their newborns. It was the warmest place in the camp, kept alive by a massive, ancient photic crystal that sat in a central pedestal. But even from the entrance, I could see the problem. The central crystal was cracked, its light a dull, sickly gray. It was dying. We entered a small, private chamber at the back of the dome. On a bed made of woven silver grass lay a small boy. His skin was so translucent I could see the skeletal structure beneath, and his veins were not glowing at all. They were dark, like ink frozen in water. His breathing was shallow, a rattling sound that made my own chest ache. "Malik," Zalara whispered, kneeling beside the bed. "Mom is here." I brought the light. The boy's eyes flickered open. They were the same milky white as his mother's, but they lacked the spark of life. He reached out a tiny obsidian hand, but it fell back onto the grass before it could reach her. She pulled the stolen crystal from her leather bag. It flared to life, filling the small room with a brilliant, golden radiance. The Vash warriors at the door flinched, shielding their eyes from the intensity of the dayside light. For them, this was like looking at the heart of a star. I stepped forward, pulling the portable power cell from my pack. It was a standard-issue Solari battery designed to power a tactical exosuit for 48 hours. "Wait," I said, as Zalara prepared to place the crystal against the boy's chest. "If you just give it to him all at once, his system will overload. It's like giving a starving man a 10-course meal. You'll kill him." Zalara stopped, her hands trembling. "Then how?" I knelt beside her, my large gloved hands looking clumsy next to her delicate frame. I took the crystal from her. It felt warm, almost vibrating with untapped potential. I began to connect the micro-leads from my power cell to the crystal's facets. "I'm going to use the cell to regulate the discharge," I explained, my voice clinical as I reverted to my technical training. "We need a steady, low-frequency pulse. I'll sync it to his heart rate." I checked Malik's pulse. It was slow, 40 beats per minute. A human would be in a coma at that rate. I tapped into my datapad, pulling up the radiant immersion specs I had stolen from Bastion 9. I began to adjust the settings on the power cell, the screen glowing blue in the dim room. "Check 6, Zalara," I whispered, using the military slang for "watch your back." "I'm going to start the infusion. If his skin starts to crack or glow red, tell me immediately." Zalara nodded, her eyes fixed on her son. I pressed the activation switch. A soft, golden hum filled the room. The photic crystal began to pulse, a steady rhythmic beat that matched the slow throb of the boy's heart. I placed the crystal on his chest, right over his sternum. For the first minute, nothing happened. The boy remained still, his breathing erratic. Zalara was praying, a low, melodic chant in her own tongue. The Vash warriors stood like statues, their shadows stretched long and jagged against the living walls. Then a flicker. A single vein in Malik's neck began to glow. It was a pale, honey-colored light, barely visible at first, but then it spread, crawling down his arm, across his chest, and into his fingertips. The dark ink in his veins began to dissolve, replaced by the warm liquid gold of the crystal's energy. His breathing changed. It became deeper, more rhythmic. The rattling sound vanished. "He is drinking the light," Zalara whispered, tears of glowing fluid running down her face. "He's stabilizing," I said, checking the readout on my pad. "His cellular resonance is climbing. 30%, 40, 50. Suddenly, the boy's eyes snapped open. For the first time, they weren't clouded. They were a bright, piercing amber. He looked at Zalara, then he looked at me. He didn't scream. He didn't look afraid. He reached out and touched the sleeve of my tactical suit. "Mama?" he asked, his voice like a silver bell. "Who is the Sun Man?" Zalara let out a sob and pulled him into her arms, cradling him against her chest. She looked at me over his shoulder, and the gratitude in her eyes was so intense, it felt like a physical blow. "He is a friend, Malik," she said, "the bravest friend we have." I stood up, feeling a sudden wave of exhaustion wash over me. I had been awake for over 24 hours. I had deserted my post, I had evaded a hunter drone, and I had performed an illegal medical procedure on an enemy combatant. I was a full-spectrum mess, but as I watched the boy's skin begin to glow with healthy, vibrant light, I realized I hadn't felt this good in 15 years. I walked to the entrance of the hard hearth, needing to breathe some air that didn't smell like Vash resin. The lead warrior, the one with the missing tusk, was still there. He looked at me, his red veins fading into a neutral orange. "You saved the sprout," he said, his voice less gravelly than before. "I helped," I said. "Xylara is the one who did the heavy lifting. She's the one who walked into a human fortress with nothing but a leather bag." The warrior nodded slowly. He reached into a pouch at his belt and pulled out a small, jagged piece of obsidian. He held it out to me. "This is a fang of the earth," he said. "It is a mark of a brother in arms. If you stay in the ring, show this to any Vash you meet. They will not kill you." Immediately. I took the stone. It was cold and sharp. "Thank you." "You are a strange demon, son man," the warrior said, a hint of a smile touching his tusks. "You break your own rules to save a child who will grow up to fight you?" "Maybe he won't have to," I said. "Maybe by the time he's my age, the rules will be different." The warrior laughed, a harsh barking sound. "Peace? Between the day and the night? That is a dream for poets and fools." "I am a soldier," I said, looking out at the Violet Valley. "I have seen what happens when we follow the rules of war. I think it's time we tried being fools for a while." I stayed in the camp for 3 days. In that time, I became a ghost story to the Vash and a savior to Xylara's family. I taught their healers how to use the power cell to regulate the light for other children who were beginning to dim. In return, Xylara taught me the names of the stars from their perspective. On the 3rd night, we sat together on a ridge overlooking the valley. Malik was sleeping in the dome, his heart light strong and steady. "What will you do now, Kalen?" Xylara asked. "You cannot go back to Bastion 9. They will kill you." "I know," I said. "I'm a flatliner. No rank, no home, no country." "Stay with us," she said. "We are building a resistance, not to fight the humans, but to protect the ring. There are others like you, deserters, outcasts, people who are tired of the blood. We call ourselves the Twilight Accord." I looked at her. Her skin was glowing with a soft, content violet. She looked beautiful in a way that no human woman ever could. "The Twilight Accord," I repeated. "Sounds like a bunch of poets and fools." "It is," she said, smiling. "And we need a soldier to teach us how to survive." I thought about Leonard back at the base. I thought about the thousands of credits I had in my military savings account, now frozen and useless. I thought about the bed in my barracks that was probably being used by some new recruit who didn't know the first thing about the dark. I reached out and took her hand. Her skin was cool like polished stone, but the warmth of her veins pulsed against my palm. "I think I've had enough of the sun for one lifetime," I said. "I think I'd like to see what the night looks like." As we sat there, a shooting star streaked across the violet sky, a brilliant line of white light that bridged the gap between the day and the night. For a moment, the world was silent, and I realized that the rules of men were nothing compared to the endurance of the heart. I had broken every law I had ever known, and in doing so, I had finally found the one thing the Solari Coalition could never give me: a reason to stay alive. 3 months had passed since I traded the sterile white corridors of Bastion 9 for the shifting violet mists of the Twilight Ring. In that time, I had become a Shadow Walker, a title the Vash gave to those who could move between worlds without belonging to either. My tactical suit was now a patchwork of human-grade Kevlar and Vash-grown resin, an ugly but effective armor that mirrored the fractured state of my own identity. We were currently camping in the Obsidian Fangs, a range of needle-sharp mountains that marked the deepest reach of the neutral zone. I was sharpening my pulse blade by the low glow of a dimmer light when Xylara entered the small natural alcove. She looked troubled, her bioluminescent veins pulsing a frantic, sharp indigo. "Kalen, we have a situation," she said, her voice tight. "The scouts found a breach in the lower mantle, near the sinking flats. Aetheris Corp markings." I stood up, the old military instinct kicking in before my brain could even process the name. Aetheris Corp. They were the civilian contractors who handled the logistics for the Solari Coalition, but they were effectively the shadow government of the Dayside. They owned the mines, the ships, and most importantly, the patent on the photic crystal refinement process. "What were they doing that far into the ring?" I asked, checking the charge on my blade. "That's Vash territory by treaty." "They weren't just scouting, Kalen," she replied, her eyes flashing with a sudden dark anger. "They were harvesting, but not the crystals. They were taking the shattered. I felt a cold prickle of dread. When a Vash died, they didn't decay. They crystallized into inert, glass-like remains known as the shattered. To the Vash, these were not just corpses, they were sacred ancestral records. To a human corporation, however, they were high-density silica with unique energy-conductive properties. "They're grave robbing," I whispered. "It's worse than that," Zylara said. "Move your gear. We're heading out. We need to see this for ourselves before the Accord decides to go to war." We moved through the canyons like ghosts, traveling 30 kilometers through terrain that would have killed a standard infantry squad. The sinking flats were a treacherous expanse of liquid-heavy silt and jagged glass outcroppings. As we reached the ridge overlooking the excavation site, I pulled out my long-range optics. Below us, a massive automated harvester, a machine the size of a city block, was churning through a Vash burial mound. It looked like a giant metal insect, its mandibles tearing into the earth and spitting out the crystalline remains of Vash elders into high-pressure crushers. "Stun it!" I hissed, seeing the Aetheris logo emblazoned in bright gold on the harvester's flank. "They're not just taking the remains. Look at the refinery pipes." I handed the optics to Zylara. Along the side of the harvester, thick translucent pipes were pumping a glowing amber fluid into armored transport crates. "That's Heartlight," Zylara whispered, her voice trembling. "They are liquefying the shattered. They're turning our ancestors into fuel." My stomach turned. I had spent 12 years guarding the photic crystals, believing they were natural minerals harvested from the planet's core. The Coalition propaganda had always said the crystals were gifts from the sun. But looking at that machine, the truth was blindingly obvious. The purest crystals, the ones we used for our highest tech weapons and life support systems, weren't mined. They were processed from the dead. "This is how they keep the war going," I said, the realization hitting me with the force of an orbital strike. The more Vash die, the more fuel the Coalition gets. The war isn't about territory or ideology, it's a harvest. Suddenly, a proximity alarm blared on my HUD. "Contact, 3 o'clock!" I yelled, diving to the left as a volley of kinetic bolts shredded the rock where I had been standing. A squad of Aetheris private security emerged from the mist. They weren't wearing the standard issue blue of the Sentinels. They were in sleek, matte black combat suits with red visors. These were Reapers, mercenaries hired to do the dirty work that even the Coalition regulars didn't have the stomach for. "Take 'em out," one of the Reapers barked. "No witnesses. Leave the glint for the harvester." Zylara didn't hesitate. She lunged forward, her crystalline spear glowing with a fierce, blinding white. She was a blur of motion, a warrior of the night fighting for her ancestors' peace. I followed her, my pulse blade humming a lethal blue song. The fight was brutal and fast. I took down 2 of the Reapers with surgical strikes to their power packs, watching as their suits short-circuited in a shower of sparks. Zylara was a whirlwind, her spear punching through the black armor like it was made of paper. "Kaelin, watch your 6!" Zylara screamed. I spun around just in time to see a Reaper leveling a heavy disruptor at my chest. Before I could move, a small, dark shape slammed into the mercenary's legs. It was Jax, the young recruit from Bastion 9. "Jax?" I gasped, parrying a knife strike from another Reaper. "Vane, get down!" Jax yelled. He threw a thermal detonator at the disruptor-wielding mercenary. The explosion was deafening, a wall of heat and sound that sent the Reapers scattering. In the chaos, we managed to retreat into the deeper canyons. Jax followed us, his armor scorched and his breathing heavy. We didn't stop until we reached a hidden cave system 5 kilometers away. I shoved Jax against the cave wall, my pulse blade humming centimeters from his throat. "What are you doing here, kid?" I snarled. "Are you tracking me for the Coalition?" "Drop the blade, Kaelin. I'm bugging out too," Jax shouted, his hands raised. "I saw the reports. I saw what they were doing at the sinking flats. I'm a soldier, not a butcher. When I heard you had gone rogue to help a glint, I thought you were crazy. But then I saw that machine. I saw what they were doing to the dead." I slowly lowered my blade, but I didn't sheath it. "You're a long way from home, Jax." "There is no home anymore," the kid said, his voice cracking. "The Coalition is moving. They're launching a full-scale reclamation in 48 hours. They're not just going for the ring. They're going to level the nightside cities to provide enough raw material for the new fleet. Xylara stepped forward, her veins pulsing a dangerous, angry red. They're going to kill us all to fuel their ships. Yes, Jax said, looking at her with a mix of awe and terror. And I have the decrypted flight paths. They're targeting the Heart Hearth first. The Heart Hearth, where Malik was, where the Vash children were. We have to stop them, Xylara said, turning to me. Kalen, you know their tech. You know their weaknesses. You have to help us fight. I looked at the two of them, the Vash mother who had shown me mercy, and the human boy who had risked his life to find the truth. The humanitarian lesson I had been trying to learn was no longer a philosophical question. It was a tactical necessity. We can't just fight them, I said, my voice cold and focused. If we engage their main force, we lose. We're outgunned 100 to 1. We have to hit the source. We have to show the people on the day side what their clean energy really costs. How? Jax asked. The Aetheris hub, I said. It's the central relay for all the harvesters. If we can hijack the broadcast frequency, we can send the raw footage of the sinking flats to every hab unit in the coalition. We stop the war by ending the lie. That hub is at the center of the Twilight Fortress, Jax said, his face pale. It's the most heavily guarded spot on the planet. It's a suicide mission. I looked at Xylara. I looked at the jagged obsidian stone the Vash warrior had given me. Sometimes, I said, echoing the words I had heard months ago, the only way to make a better rule is to break the one that's killing you. Are you in? Jax looked at Xylara, then at me. He gave a sharp military nod. I'm in. Xylara touched my arm, her hand cool and steady. Strength protects Kalen Vane, but tonight, truth will endure. The approach to the Twilight Fortress was a nightmare of vertical climbing and thermal evasion. The fortress sat atop the Pillar of Noon, a massive spire of basalt that caught the very first rays of the sun. It was the hub of the Coalition's power in the ring, a fortress designed to be impregnable from both the ground and the air. We had 36 hours before the reclamation began, 36 hours to infiltrate a high-security military installation and commit the greatest act of treason in the history of the Solari Coalition. As we climbed the sheer face of the pillar, the wind howled around us, a predatory sound that threatened to rip us from the rock. My fingers were numb, and the recycled air in my mask tasted like old copper. Talk to me, Jax, I whispered into the short-range comms. Where is the thermal blind spot? Upper vent 14, Jax's voice crackled back. He was 20 meters below me, hauling a heavy data spike. It's where they dump the excess heat from the cooling racks. If we time it with the exhaust pulse, we can slip inside without triggering the infrared sweep. We reached the vent just as a massive plume of white steam hissed into the violet sky. We scrambled inside, the heat nearly melting my visor, and dropped into the maintenance crawlspace. Inside, the fortress was a hum of activity. I could hear the rhythmic clank of boots on the decks above us and the low, constant drone of the data servers. This place felt like a machine, cold and unyielding. It was the world I had been born into, and now I was its virus. We moved toward the central hub. Every corner we turned was a gamble. Every shadow was a potential death trap. Kalen, wait, Xylara whispered, her hand on my shoulder. She pointed to a heavy blast door at the end of the corridor. 2 sentinels stood guard, their pulse rifles held at the ready. But it wasn't the guards that caught her attention. It was the window. Through the reinforced glass, we could see a laboratory. Inside, dozens of Vash, mostly elderly and infirm, were strapped into chairs. They weren't being tortured. They were being drained. Small, needle-like sensors were attached to their veins, drawing out the bioluminescent fluid and feeding it into small, glowing vials. They're not even waiting for them to die anymore, Xylara hissed, her veins glowing a sharp, jagged purple, the color of Vash, mourning, and fury. That's the efficiency initiative, Jax whispered, his voice trembling with disgust. The reports said they were donors. They said the Vash were volunteering to help the peace process. I looked at the faces of the Vash in the lab. They didn't look like volunteers. They looked like people who had given up on the world. We have to get them out, Xylara said, her hand moving to her spear. No, I said, grabbing her arm. If we trip the alarm now, we never reach the broadcast relay. Those people stay trapped, and 10,000 more die when the fleet launches. We have to finish the mission. Kalen, they are suffering, she whispered, her voice a pain melody. I know, I snapped more harshly than I intended. But look at the bigger picture, Zylara. This is the humanitarian lesson, remember? Sometimes you have to let one light flicker so you can save the whole sun. If we fail here, there is no tomorrow for anyone. Silara looked at the lab, then back at me. Her eyes were hard, the tears of light drying on her cheeks. You sound like a soldier again, Kalen Vane. The words cut deeper than any blade. She was right. I was thinking in terms of casualties and objectives. I was falling back into the cold logic of the coalition. I'm trying to save your people, Zilara, I said quietly. Don't just save them, she replied. See them. We moved on, the weight of the lab haunting every step. We reached the central hub, a massive circular room filled with holographic displays and humming data cores. At the center stood a tall, thin man in a white Aetheris uniform. He was watching a projection of the sinking flats, a small, cruel smile on his face. Director Thorne, Jax whispered, the man who designed the harvesters. Jax, get to the terminal, I whispered. Zalera, you take the left flank. I'll handle the director. We moved with synchronized precision. I stepped out of the shadows, my pulse blade deactivated, but held firmly in my hand. Director Thorne, I said, my voice echoing in the sterile room. Thorne turned around, his eyes narrowing behind thin silver-rimmed glasses. He didn't look afraid. He looked annoyed. Sentinel Vane, he said, his voice smooth and cultured. I was told you had gone rogue. I must say, your choice of company is disappointing. The game is over, Thorne, I said, stepping toward the central console. We have the footage from the sinking flats. We have the data on the efficiency initiative. We're going to broadcast it all. Now. Thorne chuckled, a dry, dusty sound. And you think that will change anything? You think the people on the day side care where their light comes from? They want their heaters to run. They want their ships to fly. They don't want the truth. They want comfort. They haven't seen the cost yet, I said. They won't, Thorne replied. He pressed a button on his desk. Suddenly, the room was flooded with red light. Heavy blast shutters slammed down over the exits. From the ceiling, 4 automated turrets swiveled toward us, their barrels humming with kinetic energy. Did you really think it would be that easy, Kalen? Thorne asked, stepping behind a reinforced glass screen. You're a good soldier, but you've forgotten the first rule of power. The house always wins. Jax, now! I yelled. Jax lunged for the terminal, his fingers flying across the holographic keys. I'm locked out. The encryption is a 12-layer mesh. I need more time. The turrets opened fire. The room erupted into chaos. I dove behind a data stack, the kinetic bolt shredding the metal inches above my head. Zilara was a blur of violet light, leaping between the turrets and striking at their sensors with her spear. She was fast, but there were too many of them. Zilara, get down! I shouted as a turret locked onto her. She didn't listen. She knew that if she didn't disable the turrets, Jax would never break the encryption. She took a hit to her shoulder, a kinetic bolt that sent a shower of black crystalline shards into the air. She screamed, a high melodic sound of pain, but she didn't stop. She drove her spear into the turret's cooling unit, and the machine exploded in a ball of blue flame. I'm through the first layer, Jax screamed, his face covered in sweat. 9 more to go. I looked at Zilara. She was slumped against a wall, her veins pulsing a dim, dying gray. The wound in her shoulder was leaking a pool of glowing amber fluid. Kalen, she whispered, her eyes clouded. I looked at Thorne, who was watching the scene with clinical detachment. You see, Thorne said over the intercom, this is the result of your mercy, a boy who will die as a traitor and a woman who will shatter for nothing. Give me the data spike, Kalen, and I might let the boy live. I looked at Jax, who was shaking as he worked. I looked at Zilara, who was fading before my eyes. This was the turning point. I could give Thorne what he wanted. I could save my friend and the woman who had saved my soul. I could go back to being a soldier. I could follow the rules and survive. Or I could finish the mission. I could break the rules one last time. Jax, I said, my voice low and steady. I'm going to draw their fire. You don't stop until that broadcast is live. Do you hear me? You don't stop for anything. Kalen, no, Jax yelled. I didn't listen. I stood up, my pulse blade roaring to life. I wasn't just a soldier anymore. I was a man who had seen the light, and I wasn't going to let it go dark. Hey, Thorn, I roared, charging toward his glass cage. You want the data? Come and get it. The remaining 3 turrets turned toward me. The world became a blur of red light and screaming metal. I felt a bolt hit my leg, then another in my side. The pain was white hot, a sunstorm in my veins. But I didn't stop. I kept moving, a ghost in a green suit running toward the fire. I reached the central console and slammed my hand down on the manual override. It wouldn't stop the turrets, but it would drop the internal firewalls for 3 seconds. Jax! Now! Jax slammed the data spike into the port. A massive holographic screen erupted in the center of the room. It wasn't just showing in the hub. It was showing on every screen in the Twilight Fortress. It was showing in every hab unit in the dayside. The image was clear. The harvester at the sinking flats, crushing the bones of the Vash. The lab where the elderly were being drained. The face of Director Thorn smiling as he watched the harvest. What have you done? Thorn whispered, his face going pale as he saw the broadcast go live to 1 billion people. I told you, I gasped, falling to my knees as the turrets finally clicked empty. We're changing the rules. The room went silent. The red light vanished. The broadcast was out. The lie was dead. I crawled toward Xylera. She was still breathing, but her heart light was a faint, flickering amber. I took her hand, my blood mixing with her glowing fluid. We did it, I whispered. The world saw the truth. Xylera looked at the screen, then back at me. A small, beautiful smile touched her lips. They see us, Kalen, she whispered. They finally see us. Outside, the first hint of the reclamation fleet began to appear on the horizon. But they weren't firing. They were hovering, their comms channels flooded with millions of voices from the dayside, demanding to know the truth. The war hadn't ended yet. There would be more fighting, more pain, more difficult choices. But as I sat there in the ruins of the central hub, holding the hand of a woman I had been taught to hate, I knew that the darkness could never truly win as long as someone was willing to hold up the light. Strength protects, I whispered, the words finally feeling like they belonged to me. But love endures, Xylera finished, her hand tightening on mine. And in the silence of the Twilight Fortress, we watched as the sun began to rise over the night side, not as a weapon, but as a promise of a new day. The silence that followed the broadcast was more deafening than the roar of the turrets. For 10 seconds, the entire Twilight Fortress seemed to hold its collective breath. Across every screen in the central hub, the images of the sinking flats looped with merciless clarity. The crushing of the Vash remains, the liquid heartlight flowing into Aetherius crates, and the cold clinical smile of Director Thorn. It was a truth too jagged to swallow, a poison pill for a civilization built on the myth of solar purity. Director Thorn stood behind his reinforced glass, his face drained of color. He wasn't looking at me anymore. He was looking at the small communication light on his desk, which was blinking a frantic, strobe-like red. The high command was calling. The shareholders were calling. The world was demanding an explanation for the blood in their batteries. You have no idea what you have done, Thorn whispered, his voice projected through the room's intercom. You haven't started a revolution, Kalen. You've just signed the death warrant for every human on the dayside. Without that fuel, the atmospheric stabilizers fail within a month. You've traded our survival for a handful of glass monsters. I didn't answer him. I couldn't. Every breath felt like I was inhaling shards of hot metal. I dragged myself across the floor to Xylera. She was slumped against a data stack, her hand pressed against the jagged wound in her shoulder. The amber fluid was staining her obsidian skin, a glowing map of her life force leaking away. Xylera, stay with me, I croaked, my voice sounding like it was coming from a mile away. Jax, get over here. We need to patch her up and move. Jax scrambled over, his face white with shock. He was clutching a field medic kit he'd swiped from the maintenance locker. His hands were shaking so hard he could barely open the seal on the nano-bandage. Vane, the whole station is going foobar, Jax said, his eyes darting toward the blast shutters. I can hear the shouting through the vents. The lower decks are rioting. The Sentinels, Some of them are laying down their rifles. Others are starting to shoot back at the Aetheris Reapers. It's a total snafu. Good, I said, grabbing a stim shot from the kit and slamming it into my own thigh. The pain in my side dulled to a thrumming ache, and my vision snapped into a sharp, artificial focus. Help me with her. We applied a high-density resin patch to Xylara's shoulder. She gasped, her eyes snapping open, the amber light in her veins flickering back to a steady, defiant gold. She looked at me, her gaze tracing the blood on my tactical suit. "You are broken, Kalen," she murmured, her voice a low, vibrating melody. "I've been broken for 15 years, Xylara," I said, helping her to her feet. "This is just the first time the outside matches the inside. Now move. If we stay here, Thorn will find a way to vent the atmosphere in this room just to spite us." We bypassed the main elevators, knowing they'd be death traps. Instead, we took the gravity chutes used for waste disposal. It was a vertical drop of 300 meters, a stomach-turning plunge into the bowels of the fortress. We landed in the sub-basement, a dark, humid place filled with the roar of the massive cooling fans that kept the station from melting under the noonday sun. The air down here was thick with the smell of scorched ozone and panic. We moved through the maintenance tunnels, heading for the secondary docking bay, where Jax had hidden a small, unmarked long-range hopper. As we turned a corner into the main corridor of the engineering level, we ran into a wall of people. But they weren't Reapers. They were regular soldiers, Sentinels from the 3rd Infantry, men and women I had shared mess halls with for years. They were standing in a loose circle around their sergeant, a gray-haired veteran named Miller. Miller had his rifle slung over his shoulder, his helmet off. He was holding a handheld datapad, watching the broadcast of the Vash lab. "Sarge," Jax whispered, stepping forward. Miller looked up. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face a mask of weary disgust. He saw me, saw the Vash woman leaning on my shoulder, and he didn't reach for his sidearm. He just looked at the screen again. "Is it true, Vane?" Miller asked, his voice flat. "Is this what we've been guarding? A meat grinder?" I looked at the men and women behind him. They were the backbone of the coalition. They were the people who believed the rules were there to keep us safe. "It's true, Miller," I said. "Aetheris has been harvesting them for decades. The war is just a cover for the supply chain. Every time we took a Vash hill, we were just clearing the way for the harvesters." Miller spat on the floor. "My son is 3 years old, Kalen. He's got a heart condition. The doctors told me he needed the pure light treatments to stay alive. They told me it was a gift from the Coalition's genius." He looked at Xylara. She didn't flinch. She stood tall, her veins glowing with a soft, mournful violet. "I'm sorry, Miller," I said. "Truly." The sergeant looked at his squad. Then he looked at the heavy blast doors that led to the docking bays. Beyond those doors, a company of Aetheris Reapers was preparing to board the reclamation fleet. "The Reapers have orders to purge the lower decks," Miller said. "They're calling it a security sweep, but we know what it is. They want to eliminate anyone who saw the broadcast. They want to reset the narrative." "What are you going to do?" I asked. Miller put his helmet back on. He racked the slide on his pulse rifle. The sound was like a thunderclap in the narrow corridor. "My grandfather was a soldier," Miller said. "He told me that a uniform is a promise. It's a promise to protect the innocent. I don't see any innocents in the Aetheris boardroom, but I see a lot of them in the Vash camps, and I see 3 of them standing right in front of me." He stepped aside, gesturing for us to pass. "The docking bay is clear for now, but you've got about 5 minutes before the Reapers blow the locks. Go. Save the kid, Vane. If the world is going to burn, let it burn for something real." "Thank you, Miller," I said. "Check 6, Kalen," the sergeant replied. "We'll hold the doors as long as we can." We ran. We reached the hopper, a sleek, needle-shaped craft designed for high-altitude scouting. Jax jumped into the pilot's seat, his fingers flying across the controls. "Ignition in 10 seconds, Jax yelled. "Strap in." I pushed Xylara into the rear seat and buckled her in. As the engines roared to life, I looked through the viewport. I saw Miller and his squad forming a defensive line at the far end of the hall. A second later, the blast doors erupted in a wall of fire. The Reapers were here. The hopper lunged forward, the G-force pinning me against the seat. We shot out of the docking bay, diving into the violet clouds of the twilight ring, just as the fortress's external turrets began to track us. "We're clear!" Jack shouted, banking the ship into a steep dive. "But the fleet is already launching. Kalen, I'm counting 12 heavy destroyers and 48 gunships. They're heading straight for the glacial maw." "They're going to burn the evidence," Zalara whispered, her hand gripping mine. "They're going to destroy the camps before the dayside can stop them." "Then we beat them there," I said. "Jax, push the engines to 110%. I don't care if the hull melts. We have to reach the hard hearth before the first bomb falls." The journey across the ring was a blur of violet mist and screaming wind. Below us, the planet of Ethelgard looked like a wounded beast, the line between light and dark, a jagged scar of ice and fire. I looked at Zalara. She was staring out the window, her reflection in the glass glowing with an intensity I had never seen. She wasn't just a mother anymore. She was a witness. And in this world of cold rules and mechanical slaughter, a witness was the most dangerous thing you could be. The glacial maw was already under fire when we arrived. From 5 kilometers up, the valley looked like a bowl of liquid sapphire being stirred by a red-hot poker. The Aetheris gunships were circling the Vash settlement, dropping localized orbital pulses that turned the frozen ground into steam. They weren't using high explosives. They were using culling beams, targeted heat strikes designed to melt the organic resin of the Vash buildings without damaging the photic crystals beneath. It was a surgical strike, an execution disguised as a harvest. "Jax, put us down near the nursery!" I yelled over the roar of the engines. The hopper was shaking violently, the heat from the beams below creating massive atmospheric turbulence. We dove through a wall of steam, the ship's sensors screaming a warning as a gunship locked onto our tail. "I can't land! There's too much debris!" Jack screamed. "I'm going to have to hover drop you." "Do it!" I grabbed my pulse blade and a bag of thermal charges. I looked at Zalara. Her wound was still weeping, but she had picked up a discarded pulse rifle from the hopper's rack. She looked like a goddess of the night, cold and lethal. We jumped. The drop was 30 meters. I hit the ground hard, my tactical suit's dampeners taking most of the impact, but my side exploded in a new wave of white-hot agony. I rolled to my feet, my blade humming to life. Zalara landed beside me, moving with that fluid, Vash grace that defied gravity. She didn't wait for me. She was already running toward the hard hearth, her rifle spitting blue fire at a squad of Reapers who were trying to breach the nursery's outer seal. I followed her, my heart hammering against my ribs. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and the high-pitched screams of Vash children. The camp was in ruins. The beautiful glowing trees were now blackened husks, and the liquid nitrogen ponds were boiling over. I saw the lead Reaper, a massive man in heavy power armor, leveling a flamer at the nursery door. "No," I roared. I didn't think. I didn't plan. I threw my pulse blade. The weapon spun through the air, a disk of blue light that sliced through the flamer's fuel line. The backfire was instantaneous. The Reaper was engulfed in a ball of orange fire, his armor melting into his skin. I tackled the next man, my fist connecting with his visor with enough force to shatter the glass. We rolled in the steaming mud, a desperate animal struggle. I felt a knife slide into my shoulder, but I didn't care. I grabbed his throat and squeezed until the light left his eyes. "Kalen!" Zalara's voice cut through the chaos. I looked up. The nursery door was open. Zalara was standing there, holding Malik in one arm and her rifle in the other. Behind her, dozens of Vash children were huddling in the shadows, their veins pulsing a terrified, erratic indigo. "The Reapers are regrouping," she yelled. "They're bringing in a heavy walker." I looked toward the ridge. A Goliath-class combat walker was cresting the hill, its twin railguns swiveling toward the hard hearth. One shot from those guns would level the entire structure. "Jax, where are you?" I barked into my comms. "I'm engaging the gunships. I can't get to the walker." Jax's voice was strained, the sound of explosions punctuating every word. I looked at the Goliath. It was 200 meters away. I had 10 thermal charges and a broken pulse blade. It was a suicide mission. Then the sky turned white. A massive beam of pure golden light shot down from the upper atmosphere. It didn't hit the nursery. It hit the Goliath walker. The machine was vaporized in a microsecond, leaving nothing but a glowing puddle of slag on the ridge. "What the hell?" I whispered. "A heavy transport ship, emblazoned with the official Solari Coalition seal, not Aetheris, descended through the clouds. It was followed by 24 Sentinel interceptors. Kalen Vane, do you read me? The voice was deep, weathered, and familiar. Commander Leonard, I gasped. Draxos, the voice corrected with a hint of a smile. I'm currently leading a mutiny, Kalen. It turns out that when the people on the dayside saw Thorne's little home movies, they didn't react the way he expected. The Coalition Senate has declared Aetheris a rogue entity. We're here to facilitate a ceasefire. I looked at the burning camp, then at the Vash warriors who were emerging from the ruins, their spears leveled at the descending ships. Commander, they aren't going to just stop, I yelled. They've lost everything. Then make them stop, Kalen, Draxos said. You're the only one they trust. You're the bridge. I looked at Silara. She was watching the human ships with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. She saw the uniforms, the same uniforms that had guarded the harvesters. She saw the weapons that had burned her home. Silara, wait, I said, stepping between her and the Vash warriors. Get out of the way, Kalen, she hissed, her rifle aimed at the lead transport. They are here to finish what Thorne started. No, they aren't, I shouted. Silara, look at me. She turned her gaze toward me. Her eyes were wide, the pupils glowing with a dangerous, unstable light. You told me that being strong keeps your family safe, I said, reaching out a hand. But you said loving them is what makes them worth protecting. If you fire that rifle, you start the war all over again. Malik will never see the peace you promised him. They killed my people, she screamed. I know. And it's a debt that can never be fully paid, I said, my voice cracking with emotion. But look around you, the humans on those ships. They chose to come here. They chose to break their own rules to save you. They are risking treason just like I did. I took another step toward her, my heart in my throat. This was it. The entire humanitarian lesson, the whole reason I had left Bastion 9, came down to this one moment. We can keep being strong, Zylara. We can keep fighting until every one of us is a pile of glass and ash. Or we can choose the harder thing. We can choose to trust. I lowered my own weapon and dropped it into the mud. I stood there unarmed in the middle of a battlefield with 100 rifles pointed at my chest. Choose love, Zylara, I whispered. Let it endure. The silence stretched for an eternity. I could hear the crackle of the fires and the distant rumble of the retreating Aetheris fleet. Silara looked at Malik, who was clutching her leg, his little amber eyes filled with fear. She looked at the Vash warriors who were waiting for her signal. Finally, she lowered her rifle. She didn't drop it, but she lowered the muzzle toward the ground. The Vash warriors followed her lead, one by one. The red light in their veins faded into a cautious, trembling orange. The transport ship touched down. The ramp lowered, and Commander Draxos stepped out. He wasn't wearing his helmet. He walked alone, his hands empty, until he was standing 5 meters from me. He looked at the ruins of the camp, then at the Vash children. He looked at Silara. Then, the high-ranking commander of the Solari Coalition did something that no Vash had ever seen a human do. He knelt. I am Leonard Draxos, he said, his voice carrying across the valley. I am here on behalf of the people of the Dayside. We have been blind. We have been cruel. And we have been cowards. We cannot give you back what we took, but we can give you the truth, and we can give you the light. He reached into his belt and pulled out a small silver canister. He opened it, and a dozen high-grade photic crystals spilled onto the ground. They weren't processed heart light. They were the raw, unrefined stones from the deep mines, glowing with a soft, natural radiance. These are yours, Draxos said. They are a gift, not a payment. A gift for a new beginning. Zilara walked forward. She looked at the crystals, then at the man. She picked up one of the stones, feeling its warmth. Strength protects, she said softly. But love endures, Draxos finished. I felt a wave of relief so powerful I almost collapsed. The war wasn't over. There were still thousands of Aetheris mercenaries in the ring, and the Dayside was in the middle of a political civil war. But here in this frozen valley, the rules had been broken. And for the first time in 80 years, a new rule had been written in the mud and the light. I walked over to Zylara and Malik. I put my arm around her, and she leaned her head against my shoulder. What happens now? She asked. Now, I said, looking up at the violet sky where the sun was finally beginning to set. We build something better. We build a world where a boy doesn't have to steal light just to stay alive. Malik looked up at me, his little hand gripping my thumb. Are you staying, son man? I'm staying, Malik, I said. I think I've seen enough of the sun. I'd like to see the stars for a while. As the ships began to unload medical supplies and food, I looked at the horizon. The twilight ring was no longer a border. It was a bridge. And though the journey ahead would be long and filled with shadows, I knew that as long as we kept choosing compassion over protocol, the light would never truly go out. The aftermath of the battle at the Glacial Maw was not the triumphant fanfare I had seen in 1,000 recruitment hollows. There were no medals, no parades, and no clean victories. Instead, there was the smell of damp earth, the low hum of medical drones, and the heavy, suffocating weight of a silence that felt like it might never end. 3 weeks after the ceasefire was signed, I found myself standing in the center of a high-security courtroom in the Solari High Court. The building was a monolith of white marble and glass, perched on the highest peak of the dayside, where the sun was a permanent, unforgiving judge. I was wearing my formal Sentinel uniform for the last time. It had been scrubbed clean of the blood and the violet mud of the ring, but the ghost of the scent still lingered in the seams. Opposite me sat the High Command, 7 men and women whose faces were as cold as the frost on the night side. They were the architects of the code, the keepers of the rules I had shattered into 1,000 pieces. Kaylin Vane, the Chief Justice began, her voice echoing through the vaulted chamber. You stand accused of high treason, desertion, and the unauthorized distribution of classified corporate data. You have admitted to aiding an enemy combatant and facilitating the theft of coalition property. Do you have anything to say before we deliberate on your sentence? I looked around the room. In the gallery, I saw Commander Draxos, his jaw set in a hard line. Beside him was Jax, his arm in a sling, looking smaller and more fragile than I remembered. And in the very back, shadowed by the pillars, was a figure in a heavy cloak. Even from this distance, I could see the faint, rhythmic glow of amber veins through the fabric. Solara was there. She was a witness to my ending, just as I had been to her beginning. I have plenty to say, I started, my voice surprising me with its steadiness. But I suspect you've already heard it all on the broadcast. You call it treason. I call it an awakening. You call the crystals property. I call them the remains of a people we've been murdering for 80 years. Mind your tongue, Sentinel, a general barked. You are alive only because Commander Draxos argued that your actions prevented a total planetary collapse. Aetheris Corp is in ruins, yes. The civil unrest on the day side is at an all-time high. You have brought us to the brink of chaos. Chaos is just what you call it when the people you've been stepping on finally stand up, I countered. We were living a lie powered by the dead. If the cost of our comfort is the extinction of the Vash, then we don't deserve the light. The deliberation lasted for 4 hours. 4 hours of standing in that white room, watching the sun track across the ceiling. I thought about the vault in Bastion 9. I thought about the choice I made at 300 hours in the morning. I realized that even if they sentenced me to life in the orbital prisons, I wouldn't trade that moment for anything. I had finally stopped being a gear grinder and started being a human. When the justices returned, the Chief Justice looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. It wasn't hatred. It was exhaustion. Kaylin Vane, she said, the court finds you guilty on all counts. However, given the unprecedented circumstances and the role your actions played in exposing the illegal operations of Aetheris Corp, we are granting a stay of execution. Your rank is stripped. Your citizenship is revoked. You are hereby exiled to the Twilight Ring for the remainder of your natural life. A murmur went through the room. Exile. In the old days, that was a death sentence. But now? Furthermore, she continued, the coalition has agreed to the establishment of a neutral zone. You are to serve as a civilian liaison between the Solari survivors and the Vash clans. You are a man without a country, Vane. We are giving you a wasteland. See what you can build in the dark. I saluted, not out of respect for them, but as a final goodbye to the man I used to be. Leaving the courtroom, I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Draxos. He looked older, the lines around his eyes deeper. "A honorable discharge of a dishonorable kind," he said softly. "Miller didn't make it, Kalen. He held the doors at the docking bay long enough for you to get out. He wanted you to know that his son is doing better. The new medical directives have opened up the legitimate crystal mines. We're doing things the right way now." "Miller was a good soldier," I said, the grief catching in my throat. "He deserved better than a back alley fight in a maintenance hall." "We all do," Draxo said. "Jax is coming with you, you know. He's been reassigned as a technical advisor for the new settlement. He says he's tired of the sun, too." I walked out of the high court and into the blinding noon. Silara was waiting by the transport skiff. She pulled back her hood, her obsidian skin drinking in the light. She looked at me, and for the first time, she didn't look like a mother on the run. She looked like a leader. "The Accord is waiting," she said. "We have found a place, a valley where the thermal vents keep the air warm and the violet moss grows as high as a man's waist. We are calling it Nova Lux." "New light," I translated. "Appropriate." "It will be hard, Kalen," she warned. "There are still Vash who want your head. There are still humans who think we are monsters. We are building a home on a foundation of 80 years of hate." "I'm a soldier, Zylara," I said, stepping onto the skiff. "I'm used to the hard path, and I think I've had enough of easy rules." As the skiff took off, banking away from the white spires of the dayside and toward the bruised purple horizon of the ring, I looked back one last time. The coalition was fractured, but it was alive. The Vash were wounded, but they were whole. And in the middle, in the space between the fire and the frost, there was a tiny, flickering hope. Strength protects, I thought. But mercy is what gives us something to protect. 1 year later, the air in Nova Lux didn't taste like recycled copper anymore. It tasted of damp earth, ozone, and the sweet fermented scent of glowberries. The settlement had grown from a few organic tents into a thriving community of 3,000 souls. Half human, half Vash. We had built it with our own hands, mixing Solari steel with Vash resin, creating a city that looked like it had been grown rather than manufactured. I stood in the center of the town square, watching the morning shift change. It was 600 hours. In the old days, I would have been checking my pulse rifle and preparing for a day of guarding crates. Now I was carrying a stack of digital slates. "Hey, Teacher Vane!" a voice chirped. I looked down. Malik was running toward me, his skin glowing a healthy, vibrant amber. He was wearing a small human flight jacket over his Vash tunic, a gift from Jax. Behind him, a human girl named Sarah followed, her blonde pigtails bouncing as she tried to keep up with his superhuman strides. "Are we going to talk about the great solar flare today?" Malik asked, his eyes wide with curiosity. "No," I said, ruffling his hair, a gesture he had grown to love. "Today we're going to talk about the Treaty of the Maw, and we're going to talk about why it's important to ask questions even when a superior officer tells you to keep your mouth shut." I walked into the classroom, a domed structure made of translucent silica. Inside, 30 children sat together, 15 green-eyed humans, 15 white-eyed Vash. They didn't sit on opposite sides of the room. They were huddled together, trading snacks and whispering in a hybrid language that combined the clicks of the Vash with the slang of the Sentinels. I spent the next 2 hours teaching them history, the real history. I told them about the harvesters, about the lies of Aetheris, and about the courage it took for a mother to walk into a fortress. I didn't hide the ugly parts. I told them about the blood and the mistakes. "History isn't a story about heroes," I told them, leaning against my desk. "It's a story about choices. Every day you have a choice to see someone as an enemy or as a person. One of those choices is easy. The other one is what keeps the world from ending." After class, I walked through the market. I saw a Vash merchant trading medicinal moss for human-made water purifiers. I saw a retired sentinel helping a Vash elder repair a damaged resin wall. There was still tension, of course. Sometimes a glint or sun demon would be whispered in the shadows. Sometimes a fight would break out over a perceived slight, but it was the friction of growth, not the friction of war. I found Zylara in the council chambers. She was looking over the maps for the new irrigation system. She looked up as I entered, her veins pulsing a warm, content gold. "The children were loud today," she said, a smile touching her lips. "They're learning to argue," I said. It's a good sign. It means they're thinking for themselves. She walked over to me and took my hand. Draxos sent a message through the relay. The Coalition has officially recognized Nova Lux as a sovereign territory. They are sending the first diplomatic envoy next month. Let me guess, I said. It's Miller's son? Actually, it's a young man named Jax, she said, her smile widening. It seems he's been promoted to ambassador of the Fringe. Kid always did have a big mouth, I chuckled. He'll do fine. We walked out onto the balcony, looking out over the valley. The sun was hanging low on the horizon, painting the clouds in shades of crimson and violet. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my old Sentinel helmet. It was dented, the visor cracked, the Coalition insignia faded to a dull gray. I looked at it for a long time, remembering the man who had worn it. I set the helmet on the railing and turned my back on it. I didn't need it anymore. I had a different kind of armor now, one made of trust and shared light. Kalen, Zilar asked, noticing my silence. What are you thinking about? I'm thinking about that night in the warehouse, I said. I'm thinking about how close I came to pulling that trigger. If I had followed protocol, I would be a captain by now. I'd be sitting in a comfortable office in Bastion 9, and I'd be completely alone. But you didn't, she said, leaning her head against my shoulder. No, I said. I didn't. I looked out at the settlement, at the humans and Vash living together in the violet mist. I thought about all the people back on the day side who were still afraid, still clinging to their old prejudices, still following the rules that kept them separated. I wonder if you were standing in that vault at 3 a.m, with your finger on the trigger and the enemy's life in your hands. What would you do? Would you follow the orders you were given, knowing they kept you safe? Or would you risk everything to see the person behind the mask? We all like to think we are the heroes of our own stories, but the real test isn't in the big battles. It's in the quiet moments when no one is watching, and the only rule that matters is the one you write for yourself. What is the one rule in your life that you know, deep down, needs to be broken so that something better can take its place? I took a breath of the cool violet air and smiled. The sun dipped below the mountains, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the dark. I turned and walked back into the city, holding Zylara's hand as the first stars of the evening began to glow.